Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Eruvin. We are up to Perek Tet Mishnah Bet. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilui Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Ranbai v'Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Menuchatam beGan Eden. Amen. When an area in which it is permitted to carry is open to an area in which it is forbidden to carry, and there is no valid partition between them, the forbidden area causes the permitted area to be forbidden as well. For example, if a courtyard with an eruv to permit carrying is completely open on one side to a public domain or a kalmedit, it is forbidden to carry in the courtyard. And even if two permitted areas are open to each other, but it is forbidden to carry from one to the other, so for example, two courtyards, each of which made its own eruv, but they did not join together in a common eruv, carrying becomes forbidden within these areas as well, unless there is a valid partition separating them. Our Mishnah will discuss two cases where one private domain is completely open to another, but only one of them is forbidden. It begins with the case of two neighboring rooftops where the houses are not joined by an eruv. Now, since there is no eruv, it is forbidden to carry between them utensils that were in the house when Shabbat began, as the Rav explains, following the view of Rabbi Shimon in the previous Mishnah. Now, the rooftops are considered private domain due to the principle of gud asik mechitzta, which is extend and raise the wall. Now, this principle dictates that the outer walls of the house are legally viewed as rising up to the heavens. Therefore, they enclose the rooftops. The Mishnah begins, Gag gadol samuch lekatan. If there is a large rooftop next to a small rooftop with no eruv joining them and no wall separating them, and the large rooftop overlaps the small one on both sides, whoever can see in the diagram in the article elucidated brought in note 4, Hagadol mutar, the Mishnah says carrying in the large rooftop is permitted because the places where the large rooftop juts out on either side of the small one create a valid partition for the large rooftop. As the Rav explains, the house with the large rooftop is wider than the house with the small rooftop, and therefore the large house has walls on both sides of the place where the two houses meet. Those walls are also viewed as rising up to the heavens. So from the perspective of the large rooftop, there are two sections of walls on the side where the two rooftops meet. Now, although there is a gap between them, it's considered an entranceway as long as it's less than 10 amot, and it's therefore considered part of the partition, and the large rooftop is therefore separated from the small rooftop by a legal wall. Vakatan asur, but carrying on the small rooftop is forbidden because the overlaps are not considered a partition for the small rooftop since they do not close off any part of it, and therefore the small rooftop is considered completely open to the large rooftop, and since the rooftops are not joined in eruv, carrying on the small rooftop is forbidden. Now again, as we mentioned, this discussion refers to utensils that were in the house when Shabbat began. These may not be carried from the house onto the small rooftop, but utensils that were on the rooftop when Shabbat began may be carried from one rooftop to another, even without an eruv, like we learned in the previous Mishnah. The Mishnah now brings a similar case of two neighboring courtyards with no eruv between them. Chatzar gedola shenifretza lektana. If there was a large courtyard that was breached, meaning its wall collapsed, so that it now opens to a neighboring small courtyard, and the large courtyard overlaps the small courtyard on both sides of the breach, which the commentators explain each courtyard is surrounded by walls. Originally, there was also a wall between the courtyards, but it collapsed, leaving the small courtyard completely open to the large one, or if you can see in the diagram. Since the two courtyards were not joined by an eruv, carrying between them is forbidden. The Mishnah says, Gedula muteret, carrying in the large courtyard is permitted, uktana surah, but carrying in the small courtyard is forbidden, mipneshi kifitcha shel gedola, because the breach is like the entranceway of the large courtyard. Now, the overlaps on either side of the breach create a wall, and since the breach in the middle is considered an entranceway, it's also part of the wall. So from the perspective of the large courtyard, there is a valid wall separating it from the small courtyard, and here too the breach cannot be wider than 10 amot, and therefore the large courtyard has a valid wall separating it from the small one, and one may therefore carry in the large courtyard. The small courtyard, however, has no wall separating it from the large one because the walls that overlap it are not considered partitions for the smaller one, and therefore just as one may not carry between the large courtyard and the small courtyard, so too it is forbidden to carry in the small courtyard. The Mishnah now continues with the case of a courtyard bordering a public domain with no valid wall between them. Like we mentioned, rabbinic law forbids carrying in such a courtyard. The Mishnah will now address the biblical status of the area where the wall once stood. If there was a courtyard that was breached so that it's now open to a public domain. Now in this case, the breach either completely destroyed the wall separating the courtyard from the public domain or destroyed a section wider than 10 amot, and therefore there is no valid wall between the courtyard and the public domain. One who carries from the place of the breach, meaning from the place where the wall once stood, to a private domain, or from a private domain to it, chayav, he is liable for transgressing the melachav, transferring from domain to domain, because the place where the wall once stood is now considered a public domain. Now it's considered part of the public domain because when there is an overflow of traffic in the street, people will walk where the wall used to be. As the commentators explained, these are the words of Rabbi Eliezer. Now the sages disagree. They indicate the disagreement by citing the law of the courtyard itself. Now Rabbi Eliezer spoke of the law of carrying between the place of the wall and a private domain. The sages will discuss the law of carrying between the inside of this courtyard and a public domain. But the sages say, mitocha lereshut harabim, one who carries from inside the courtyard to the public domain, or mereshut harabim letocha, or from the public domain into it, patur, he is exempt, meaning he has not transgressed biblical law, because the courtyard is now like a karmelit and not a private domain. And the commentators explain, since it's completely open to the public domain, now although even 3 walls suffice to make an area a private domain, that's only where it's open to a karmelit. When it's open to a public domain, 3 walls do not suffice. Now the Mishnah says, the commentators explain, that the sages argue by the same way that the place where the wall once stood should also be considered a karmelit, not a public domain. Now the inside of the courtyard does not become a public domain, as even Rabbi Eliezer admits, because it's inconvenient for the public to use the inside of the courtyard as they travel to the public domain outside it. So too the place of the wall, the sages say, should not become a public domain, since it's also inconvenient for the public to use. Now, therefore, the commentators explain, one who carries between the place of the wall and a private domain, according to the sages, is also exempt. The Rav does say that halacha follows the opinion of the sages. Now, we explained the Mishnah according to the notes in the article elucidated. They followed the simple meaning based off the understanding of the Rav. There are different ways to understand in the Rishonim. We followed the way the notes in the article elucidated interpreted it. That is the end of Mishnah Bet. Mishnah Gimel now continues of what we concluded in Mishnah Bet. Mishnah Bet concluded with the law that a courtyard whose wall collapsed, leaving it completely open to the public domain, is treated as a karmelit. The Mishnah did not say whether it collapsed before Shabbat or on Shabbat and whether this makes any difference. Our Mishnah takes up this issue in connection with a different case in which a courtyard is breached. If there is a courtyard that was breached during Shabbat such that it's now open to the public domain on 2 of its sides, meaning the collapse occurred along one of its corners so that 2 walls are now breached and there is no longer a valid partition separating the courtyard from the public domain. Now, generally, if a wall of a courtyard has a gap that's no more than 10 amot wide, the wall is still considered a valid wall since the gap is viewed as an entrance in the wall. However, a breach at the corner of the walls cannot be considered an entrance because it's unusual to make an entrance to its corner, at a corner. Therefore, a breach at the corner leaves the court open to the public domain. Or we can see in diagram A. Now, v'chen bayit shenifratz mishtei ruchotav. Similarly, if there is a house that was breached during Shabbat on 2 of its sides, meaning along one of its corners, that would be diagram B. V'chen mavoy shenitlu korotav or lechayav. And similarly, if there is an alley whose beams or poles which serve to permit carrying in the alley were removed during Shabbat, like we learned in chapter 1, Mishnah 2, an alley needs a pole or a beam on its 4th side in order to permit carrying in it. The Mishnah says, Mutarin be'oto Shabbat v'asurin la'atid lavo divrei Rabbi Yehuda. it remains permitted to carry in all of these places for the duration of that Shabbat, but they are forbidden for future Shabbatot. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. And the Rav explains Rabbi Yehuda holds that whether it's permitted to carry in an enclosed place on Shabbat depends on what its conditions were at the beginning of Shabbat. Since the courtyard, house, or alley had valid walls when Shabbat began, we may continue to carry in them throughout Shabbat, even though their walls became invalid during Shabbat. Now, obviously, this applies only if enough of the walls remained after the collapse to qualify the area as a private domain on a biblical level. However, one may not carry in these places on the next Shabbat because when that Shabbat begins, they are not properly enclosed. Rabbi Yossi disagrees. Rabbi Yossi says that it cannot be that an area can be considered properly enclosed for one Shabbat and not properly enclosed for other Shabbatot. Rather, im mutarin le'ota Shabbat, if these places are permitted for the rest of that Shabbat, mutarin la'atid lavo, they must be permitted for future Shabbatot as well. V'im asurin la'atid lavo, and if they are forbidden for future Shabbatot, asurin le'ota Shabbat, they must be forbidden for the rest of that Shabbat as well. Since it is indeed forbidden to carry in these places on future Shabbatot, it is also forbidden for the remainder of the Shabbat in which the breach occurred. And the commentaries explain, Rabbi Yossi holds that when a wall separating a private domain from a carmelite or a public domain becomes invalid during Shabbat, one may no longer carry in the private domain. However, if the wall is needed only to separate between two private domains that have no eruv between them, like we spoke about in Mishnah 2, in which a small courtyard became breached to a large courtyard, even Rabbi Yossi agrees that the two courtyards remain permitted for the rest of that Shabbat. In that case, the loss of the wall did not open the courtyards to the outside and merely created a situation in which their individual Eruvin no longer work and a joint Eruv was needed. Rabbi Yossi agrees that a change of Eruv status does not affect the permission to carry for the rest of that Shabbat. Therefore, the Eruvin they made before Shabbat continue to permit each private domain for the rest of that Shabbat. Now, the machlok in this Mishnah applies to the case at the end of the previous Mishnah as well, as the Tosfot Yom Tov points out. The Rav does tell us, V'alcha Rabbi Yossi, the Halacha follows the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. That is in Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.